so that children really engage with the book and don't use the book as a way to establish some stereotypes. So those are the 4 things I'm going to talk about. The first one is availability. And I really want to think about what are the books that are available to us, both thinking broadly globally, but also thinking about for you as teachers of Chinese as a second language. So one of the books are books that are written by insiders to a particular global culture. So in your case, you're looking for books that are written by people who are themselves have insiders to Chinese culture and language. And that doesn't mean, they might come from a range of different contexts, but they're insiders in the sense that they speak Chinese and they've grown up within Chinese culture. So those books might include translations, or they might be books in the same language but from a range of countries. So for example, I'm very aware because of where I live that when you talk about a book in Spanish, that book might be from Spain, it might be from Mexico, it might be from Argentina, it might be from Chile. It can be from very different places, from Puerto Rico, and both the culture and the particular form of Spanish that's within those books is going to vary. So it matters. It's not just generic Spanish, and I'm sure the same thing is true for you in thinking about Chinese and thinking about the different countries where Chinese is a primary language. Just thinking about here, coming from Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and mainland China, there's differences both in your cultural experiences and that are going to be reflected in those books as well as in the Chinese. So these particular books I think are so important because they're a source of authentic literature. Sometimes they can be difficult for some of your students because, and in many of your cases, I'm going to go back to the translated books. You have a lot of books. I spent time in 3 different bookstores here in the city, and you have a lot of books that are coming from other countries that have been translated into Chinese. And those books have pros and cons for you. One is that it gives you a much broader range of literature. But the negative, of course, is that they often don't reflect Chinese culture. And they weren't written for an audience here in Taiwan, for example. They were written for, their books that were translated, they were written for children. If it was from France, they were written for children from France. If it was from the US, it's written for children in the US, but it was written for children in another country. And so in that translation, there may be aspects of the book that are harder for children in your context to understand. One of the really big differences between the US and here is that in the US we have a major problem with a lack of translated books. So in the US right now, only 2% of our books are translated, which is an extremely low amount. So virtually all the books that we have that are global literature are books that were written by Americans about that global culture rather than books written from within the culture and then translated into English for us. You have the opposite problem. When I'm in the bookstore, 80 to 90% of what I saw in your bookstore were books written in other countries and translated into Chinese. So you have too many books that come outside of Chinese culture. Does that make? We're at opposite ends of the spectrum. And for us in the United States, I think the problem is one of ethnocentricity, is that we're so focused inward that we're not looking enough at the world. But in your case, I think there's a real issue of looking too much out to the world and not also being able to nurture your own literature. But at the same time, one of the really big issues is related to that is when you look at those books, the difference between a universal book and a culturally specific book. And I want to talk because, and that comes into that issue of translation. So a universal book is a book that doesn't reflect in a deep way a specific cultural context. So for example, one of the books that is the most translated books in the world is the Very Hungry Caterpillar. I can find find that book in virtually every language in the world. And it's going to be a very useful language teaching material for us in the U.S. because many of the kids know the original story, and therefore they're able to use what they know of that original story in their own language to help them learn the new language. But that's a universal book. It doesn't reflect any one culture, and that's one of the reasons it's been translated so much. You don't read that book and have the sense of being in a specific place and time. What I find very interesting is every time I come to a place, I go back with a big sack of books. So I've come back with several big sacks of books from Taiwan, and I've got another big bag in my hotel room of books that are specifically Taiwanese. I don't want books that are translated. I want books that were written by Taiwanese authors and illustrators. And what I find interesting is that I can find virtually none of them in the U.S. except for Juji Juji. Right? It's a fabulous book. And about finding unity within difference and about the importance of relationships in determining how we belong. And it's also not culturally specific. I don't look at that book and think, this is set in Taiwan, right? There are other books that I picked up, a lot of the books that I picked up in the bookstores here are very, when I look at the pictures, they're very definitely places and locations and aspects of Taiwan that are deeply embedded into the book. I find it interesting that the only books of Taiwan that I can find in the U.S. is this culturally general book. Does that make sense? And I think that that's a tension for authors. In fact, it's a big tension around the world. I was at a conference with Ibby where a man from Norway was talking about, an author from Norway was talking, and he was saying that as an author, if he writes books set in his own culture that are very specifically Norwegian, and he writes them for children of Norway, that book never gets picked up for translation and taken to other countries. So the amount of money that he can earn is like barely nothing. You know, it's enough to maybe put one meal on his plate. But if he writes a book that's universal, that goes across many cultures, that he writes a book that you can't tell, the location isn't specific, that's a book that can get picked up and get translated. So the tension for him is, he wants books for children of his own country, but if he writes those books specific to their own culture and location, they don't sell them. And that same thing, I can see the same thing in the books that I've been looking at from Taiwan, is if the book is very specific to Taiwan, which your children need that live here in Taiwan, the author has also limited their audience. And that's just an incredible market issue. But what I'm really looking for are culturally specific books. So for example, I've got two there that are both translations for us, from Chinese into English. One is called A New Year's Reunion, which is a story which is about, set in China, of migrant families where the father has to be away most of the year working and can only come, in order to find jobs, they can only come back to visit the family once or twice a year. And then there's a lot of statistics at the back of the book about the number of families, the number of migrant families in. And the second one, The Magic Course of Hangan, is a beautiful, beautiful book about that particular artist and done in his style. So those are books that are culturally specific. But I think what's also interesting about those books is that the best books that are available, I think, are ones that combine the universal with the specific, culturally specific. So for example, A New Year's Reunion is a little girl who's missed her father, and he's come back to visit. And you know, it's about the relationship between her and her father. Well, children everywhere can connect to that notion of missing a parent and celebrating the time that you can spend with, and having a special relationship with that parent. So that book is both culturally specific in that it's the setting is very clearly China. There's many different aspects of Chinese culture interwoven in the book, but it's also universal. that children everywhere can connect to. And the same thing, the Magic Course of Hang'an really celebrates imagination. And so I would argue it's both of those as well. And I looked for that as I was in bookstores. So for example, one of the books that I picked up in the bookstore is this one, which is a story about a boy and his father who are going to visit the seaside together, taking the train and spending the day together. And it's very specific to a particular location in Taiwan, but it's also universal in the sense of a child spending a special day with their parent. And also, there's another aspect of the story which is missing the mother who has passed away, and so having someone missing from your life. So there's different aspects that children anywhere can connect to, but it's also specific to Taiwan. The other book that I thought was really interesting in thinking about this, how do we combine, as we're looking for literature, how do we find books that are universal? So all of your children, no matter what background they come from, they can find something in that book to connect to, as well as learning about Chinese culture and language. So this is a wordless book. And in this book is a story of an old man and his special relationship with a dog. And in the story, the elderly man is sent away in an ambulance. And the dog picks up his walking sticks and travels the entire length of Taiwan to get right. And so throughout the book, there are many, many locations that if you're from Taiwan, you'll recognize. But if you're not Taiwanese, you still connect with this relationship between an animal and a person. So there's still that universal connection. The other thing that I think is so powerful about a wordless book, and you may say, why in the world would you use a book without words to teach Chinese? Because a wordless book, you pick up and you tell your own story, right? So what it allows a child to do is whatever oral language they have, they can use to tell a story. So the book adapts to them and to their current level of oral language, and gives them a real reason to use that language to tell the story. We're using wordless books in lots and lots and lots of ways with language learners. Sometimes just to orally tell the story, sometimes to write their own version of the story. Sometimes it's dictated and then they use it for their own reading practice. But wordless books are an incredible source of materials. Now, one other issue to be aware of when you're looking at a translated book is what the translator did in translating it. And so it might be translated into Chinese, but what changes have made, right? So one of the big issues in the field is the whole notion of what's called foreignization and domestication. Essentially what that means is when the translator is translating the book, and they're worried, and they're putting it, let's say they're putting it into Chinese, and they say, well, a Chinese child is not going to be familiar with the name of this food. And so they change it to something that's Chinese. Or the translator says, the name of these characters are going to be hard for children to read in Chinese, so I'm going to change the names. They might be French characters, but I'm going to change the names to Chinese names. The problem is that when you wipe out all traces of the global culture, the book becomes generic. So we've had books translated into English, for example, where everything about that book, let's say it was a Chinese book that got translated into English, everything about that book that was Chinese is now been Americanized. And so the child who's reading it doesn't even realize they're reading a book set in China. That's a big issue. On the other hand, if you keep too many names of places and terms that are really unfamiliar to children, they might have a very hard time reading the book. So the tension is between readability and understandability and maintaining the cultural integrity of the book. So most translators try to do something that's in between, to make some changes to help children understand it, but at the same time to not make so many changes that you can't tell that it's set in a global setting. But just because a book is translated, you really need to look carefully and say, is the culture still retained in that particular And I could give you lots of examples. So I think one of the things in thinking about translated books, and one of the reasons I'm talking a lot about that, is that the tension you have is I think you need to be using two kinds of books as you're teaching Chinese as a second language. One is that you need to find books that have been translated into Chinese that are from the child's own mother tongue, own home culture. So yesterday I interacted with, during the tour, with a girl from Honduras, right? And so she's learned a great deal about Chinese culture, and I would argue that when she first began learning Chinese, it would have been helpful for her to have books that were set in South America or Central America, but translated into Chinese, because she would have at least recognized the culture in the book, even as she was learning the new language. So when both the culture and the language are both new to a child, it can be very difficult. And they can also feel like they're just disconnected from anything they know. So we're using the same principle in our work with children in Tucson. So they're coming from one of the largest groups, you'll be very surprised, one of the largest groups of refugees in Tucson is the Nepali Bhutanese. And I don't quite know how they got to Tucson, but there's a very large community and then a very large community of Somali. So we're trying to find books that are written in English, because they're trying to learn English, but are set in their own home countries. So there's something that they can recognize and connect to, and so we're honoring their home culture as they're learning this new language. But then you also, of course, need books that are very much that are in Chinese language, that are very much based in Chinese culture, because you're wanting them to learn Chinese culture. So I think you need to be aware of both kinds of books and their purpose for children. I would argue that some of their books, that when a book reflects the child's own home culture, particularly as a beginning language learner, you make that language just a little more accessible for them, because they already have an understanding of that culture. And then of course you need to bring in the books that are Chinese. This is just a quick photograph taken on my bed last night. You have an incredible richness of books here in Taiwan. I have to search for them, and I depend on Chen Chen and Wen Yu to help me find them when I go to the bookstore. But there are really rich books here that are written in Taiwan and published by Taiwanese authors and illustrators. So I want to talk a little bit more about the different backgrounds of authors who write these books, because their backgrounds make a big difference in what's in the book and what purposes that book might have for you. So one of the groups of authors who are writing for children are authors who what I would call transnational. They're authors that move across cultures, they move across global boundaries, oh, sorry, I'm talking about the bottom one. Let me do the first one, I forgot. One of the things that I did want to say, it was a warning, is just because a book has been translated doesn't mean that it actually reflects the culture of, that it is authentic to the culture, because the author might be writing about a culture that's not their own. So for example, one of the books that I've used is a book called The Killer's Tears. It's a book that was translated from French, and it won a big award in France. But that book, and the author is French, has lived in France for many, many years, award-winning author. The book is based in Chile. So just because a book is translated doesn't mean that the author actually is writing about a culture they know. Does that make sense? Always have to look at who the author is and their location. But the bottom one is I'm finding a really interesting group of authors who are globally mobile. They live in different places in different countries. So for example, the book off to the right, The Magic Board, is written by Baba Wage Jiakate. He lives in both Mali and the US. So he lives in Portland, Oregon part of the year, and he lives in Mali part of the year. And he writes books set in Mali. And so therefore, he has an understanding of both global contexts. An interesting author is Susie Lee, who is Korean. She's lived in the US, she's lived in Singapore, she's now living back in Korea, but but she's somebody who's transnational, who's lived in multiple locations. And those are authors that I often find are really very powerful in terms of how they write their books, because they not only understand the culture that they're writing about, but they understand the broader global world as well. And they're aware of how they tell their story, how it will be understood both by children from within the culture as well as outside of the culture. You also want to look for books, one other set of books, and these are books that we're finding a lot in the United States, and I don't know so much here. But we're finding a lot of books in the U.S. written by authors who are immigrants from a particular country and who write about their country of origin. So I've got actually a lot of examples here that are Chinese. So for example, Ed Young. He's written books like Lan Popo, Mouse Match, The Voices of the Heart. His books are picture books. They're beautiful, beautiful picture books. Many of them are set in different parts of China. And the books on the left are all books that primarily are written about the Cultural Revolution. So, for example, Yang Chang Kompenstein's Revolution is Not a Dinner Party. The story is about her own childhood, about growing up in China during the Cultural Revolution, and so it provides an authentic account. Here's the problem. When immigrants write about their country of origin, they write about the past. So one of the things that you'll notice is all of these books are either traditional literature or historical fiction. So the problem with the books from the immigrants is that you don't get any images of contemporary life, because what they know is set in their own past. Does that make sense? And so you want to be careful. I mean, those books are interesting sources. Also, for some people, less so with Ed's books. Ed Young's books, picture books, are primarily traditional literature. But many of the books that are set at the time during the Cultural Revolution are about the immigrant is someone who left at a time of great upheaval, and because their own lives and family were in danger. So their memories of their home country are not very positive, right? So they can portray a much more negative view of their own home country because they left during that time of upheaval. And even when they try to write books that are set in contemporary, they may still set them in the past without realizing them. So for example, the book, The Trip Back Home, that's down in the bottom right corner, is written by Janet Wong, and she is both Korean and Chinese in her heritage. And it's about a trip back to Korea. But when you look at the book, my Korean students who looked at that book get very upset because it's set as if it's contemporary, but what they see is a Korea of the past. They see the small villages, they see a life that hasn't been there for 50 years. And that's, again, because she's basing it on memories rather than actual knowledge. So these are books that have an authenticity to them because the immigrant has this knowledge of the country, but they tend to be very much based in the past. And too much use of this kind of book can, as you're working with children from other countries, can give them the sense of Chinese culture as only in the past, not as also now. And then there are authors who draw on their family heritage. So they've always grown up in their current country, but their family's heritage is someplace else. So for example, my name's Kyoko, which is Linda Sue Park, who is second generation Korean. And the book is based in her mother's own, loosely based on her mother's experiences during the Japanese occupation of Korea. But it was a book she had to really research. In fact, Linda talks about she married a man who was from Ireland. And she realized as her sons were growing up that her sons knew and understood Irish culture very well, but knew very little about their Korean heritage. And for her, as a child, her parents had tried to Americanize her as quickly as possible, right? Because they wanted her to be successful in this new country. And that while of course she had Korean values because of living in her household, she had very little knowledge. And so in order to write that book, she had to do an incredible amount of research. An interesting author that I thought was thinking about relationship to Taiwan is Grace Lin. Grace Lin is Taiwanese American. Most of her books, like The Year of the Dog, are about being Taiwanese American and in the U.S. But she's got an interesting series that started with Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, which are fantasy quests. And as part of those fantasies, she weaves in all kinds of Chinese traditional literature. So there are 3 books, and the current one on the silver, I'm trying to think of the exact title, When the Sea Turns Silver, has just been nominated for our National Book Award, which is a huge, huge award. But she's a really interesting author. I'm hoping that her books are getting translated into Chinese because she combines fantasy, really interesting fantasy quests. And as the characters are on their fantasies, they're continuously being told stories that come out of traditional Chinese folklore. And then there are other authors. There are authors who live in a country for a significant period of time and write based on that time. So for example, there are authors who are journalists, or there's somebody who's worked in a particular business, or they're an international teacher, or they've been part of a global aid organization. And they write about their time in that culture. Those books, to be honest with you, may or may not be authentic. Because you can live, as you all know, expats can live in a particular place and never actually know that place, right? Just talk with the expat community. Or they can really become part of that culture. So the author I wrote here is Holly Thompson. She's American, but she's lived in Japan for over 20 years as an international teacher, and she's written some very powerful novels and picture books set in Japan. There are also authors who research a country or culture and may or may not visit that place. And to be really frank, those are the authors that you have to be really careful. Sometimes they do very, very careful research, and their books are authentic, but other times there are problems in their books. There are mistakes that they made. So, for example, this particular book, What Heaven Fell, which is about Vietnam, is a book that was researched by the author, and it does have some problems in it, because there's some aspects of the culture she didn't fully understand. And then this is a new trend, one I haven't seen with any of the Asian literature so far, but there are now authors who are working in collaboration with someone from that country. So the book I have here is actually set in Palestine. It's called A Little Piece of Ground. The primary author, Elizabeth Laird, is British, but she's co-authored the book with a woman who is Palestinian, who's a Palestinian anthropologist. Laird actually did the writing, but she knew that culturally she didn't understand Palestinian culture deeply. So she collaborated with this Palestinian anthropologist so that the story wouldn't have inauthentic aspects to it. And I'm seeing more and more of that, which I think is a really good trend. Now, the other issue of availability is what's missing. So as I look at books from many different global cultures, what I find is a lot of historical fiction and folklore, with some informational books and poetry, but very little contemporary fiction. So, and that was one of the things I was looking for when I was looking in the